Our guest today is Rachel Faulkner Brown of Milton, Georgia, co-founder of Be Still Ministries and director of its Never Be Alone Widows Retreats. Rachel experienced the instant loss of two husbands herself, one to an aneurysm and one in an Air Force plane crash, by the time she was 31. As a result of her losses, Rachel began organizing retreats to empower military and first responder widows so they feel known and have a safe community to turn to. Rachel loves marriage so much that she took a chance on it again and married for a third time. Rachel Faulkner Brown, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thank you, Chris. What a joy to be with you. I mean, I always say, let's do the next right thing. So I love the title of your podcast.
No, thank you. And just so our listeners are aware, I mentioned briefly about Rachel's past. So when I reached out to her a month or so ago to be on the show, her immediate response was, "How fun!" Exclamation point, smiley emoji. So got a lot of energy and a lot of spunk with us today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
You know, the millennials hate our use of emojis. They think it's overrated. I don't. I can't even talk without them. I'm like, how do you talk without an emoji?
It's going to be like in the dictionary now, like to Google's a verb, emoji is going to be some action that we do. So it'll be a noun or a verb. Emoji.
Totally.
So Rachel, you've called yourself a girl with a past like your worst nightmare and a present that is pretty darn fun. Mm-hmm. That's a very upbeat way to view life as someone who was twice widowed by the time you were 31. Tell us how you met your first husband, Todd Faust, what the courtship was like when you were married, how your life was during that marriage. I'm throwing a lot at you, a lot of details, and take some time to share that story.
Yeah, totally. So, for me, I grew up in a small southern town in Alabama and just kind of had a really picturesque life. I was thinking about this the other day. My granddaddy would wear Bermuda shorts and wingtip shoes every day to the lake and taught all of my friends how to water ski. That was kind of my growing up. It was really precious. But I, went to college, met Todd Faust. He drove through the parking lot the first day that I was actually on campus at our college, and he had a license plate that said T Faust. And I was like, oh my gosh, like he is rich. Like no one I know has spent the extra $50 at the DMV to get a personalized license plate. So I was like, oh my gosh, he's cute, he's rich, and he was driving a Toyota Celica. And in 94, that was like the car, with a spoiler. And I was like, oh my gosh, a spoiler, like got to meet this guy. And so we went out on our first date, and, pretty much he took me to watch Rudy with his mom. And I really, we went to dinner and then we went and watched Rudy. And I think, golly, like, if my son brought his girlfriend over to watch Rudy with me, I would be like, what? I love her. And you're such a great kid, So it was amazing. And we dated all 4 years of college. Todd was president of Sigma Chi. He was, on the Student Government Association. We were kind of like, we were just all involved. Our school was about a school of 5,000 people. So it was pretty easy to be really involved. And he ran cross country. So it's like super healthy. And what's funny is at this point, I didn't even work out. I never worked out a day in my life. And here he is like waking up at 5:30 in the morning to go run 8 miles and then running again at 3:00 in the afternoon. I was like, wow, that was one thing that we definitely didn't have in common. But he was just an all-American guy. And we got married. He proposed and we got married the weekend after I graduated in 98 and just moved immediately to Tuscaloosa. I started graduate school. He was working for a pharmaceutical company, and our life was beautiful. It was like any newly married. I mean, I was 21, which is like, today nobody gets married at 21. So it's like basically Mary got married, it was like Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's so young. Like I look at Davis, my son's 15, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I was married 6 years from this moment. And that just blows my mind. So here he is, working in Tuscaloosa, and we get an opportunity to move back, and they offer me a job with his pharmaceutical company. So we were like Eli Lilly and Company, Florence, Alabama. I mean, we were living the dream, dual income, no kids, with a dog. We we're like the marketer's dream. and just living this beautiful life. We're very involved in our Sunday school class, and I was planning all the parties. He was planning all the sports events, and when they were going to play basketball, what you do when you don't have kids. Where are we playing basketball this week? And life was beautiful. And on Sunday, September 16th, so it was a half second after September 11th, 2001, life just radically changed for us. And I don't know if you want me to keep going, but
Please do.
the September 11th changed all of us. I mean, there's not a one of us probably listened to this podcast that their life wasn't dramatically affected by that day. And we were no different. I was sitting in my office just like I am right now. I was watching the Today Show. I saw the plane hit the tower. I actually had a friend in the tower on the 65th floor. And, I remember calling my dad that day, Chris, and being like, should I leave the house? Because we didn't know if this was going to start happening. And I mean, it really felt like Armageddon. I know you can relate. And I remember gas gouging that day, that afternoon. I finally did leave the house. And I remember gas being like $4 a gallon in Florence, Alabama. And at this point, I was paying 99 cents a gallon. So, it was just like, we were just all over the place mentally that week. And then on that Sunday, we go to church. It was like, we all remember that day going to church. I think everybody in America went to church on the 16th of September. And we had gone to eat barbecue afterward. And I remember us talking about having babies. We've been married 3.5 years, and Todd went to play. He had organized a game of pickup basketball that afternoon, and he went to play that game of basketball, and I went to a wedding shower, and I got a phone call as soon as I walked in the door that he had been hurt. And she said, I think he broke his leg, my best friend. And I was like, okay, be right there, and raced and saw his best friend at the gas station. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody. I started calling my parents and saying, I think Todd's been hurt. And I pulled up onto the scene, and Todd he was 27, and he had a massive aneurysm. And here I was, 23 years old, our life just in front of us, having just walked through September 11th, and I'm having my personal September 11th. And he had lost a heartbeat. We had a doctor there on site playing basketball, one of our doctors that we called on, and he had started CPR, but I couldn't go in the ambulance. So we raced to the ER, and it was just like you see in the show ER. They came through the doors and they semi-spoused. We did everything we could. And I mean, to say the devastation at that age, when you've never experienced anything, bad things happen to bad people, but bad things don't happen to good people at 23. It was just like, I'd lost a dog, I'd lost a grandparent, I'd never lost a friend, and I'd certainly never lost anyone that age. And yeah, I mean, to say the lights went out on my future is like an understatement. But I think the biggest thing for me was the moment that, they came through those doors, and I remember walking back through, and I don't talk about this often, but I remember laying my body over Todd's and looking down. He still had on his basketball shoes. And I like, for those of us who've lost family members, or those of us who've been in that moment where someone passes, the enormity of the loss is it's just so heavy. And then I'm sitting there watching his parents lose a child, and I'm losing someone that I've been with for 7.5 years. And it doesn't feel real. I mean, I literally felt like I was dreaming. And then I come out through the double doors to leave, and there are hundreds of people, because no one could believe that Todd Faust had passed away. And we went back home, which is, what do? You can't stay there. So we go back home, and my sweet friend Melanie was standing in my kitchen. And at this point in Melanie's life, she had been in college with us. Her husband was a fraternity brother of Todd. She'd grown up, in a religious home, just like the rest of us. But Melanie had just kind of, gotten married and walked away. Basically, she was just like, I'm never going to be good enough. I just can't. I'm just, whatever. And she looked around and saw this community, saw our Sunday school class, saw our whole church practically in my den. And she just thought, I have no idea, one, who would be here if this happened to me. And it was just that, nothing actually, nothing brings clarity to your life like death. Nothing can bring clarity to your life like death. And she looked around and she knew in that moment, oh my gosh, like I don't even know that I know God. I mean, I've said that Jesus loves me, but do I really believe that? And so we sat down in my bedroom, and I mean, to say she stood up a new creation is, I don't know what I said. Todd had just died 3 hours earlier. And here I am, sitting with this friend who's so desperate because she is so clear on eternity. She is so clear on eternity. And I was very clear that Todd was with Jesus. I knew where he was. I was so confident of that. And at the same time, watching her hurt. And I don't know what I said. Matthew 10:20 says, when you can't speak for yourself, the Holy Spirit will speak for you. And that is 1000% what happened. I just opened my mouth and she received Jesus. I mean, and she stood up and her life's never been the same. And so, I look back at that story, Chris, and I cannot look back at that story and see anything but Todd, his beautiful wife, and Melanie, and the generations that come behind her. And that's just one story. I mean, there were lots more people whose lives were radically altered by Todd's, but it as well.
So thank you for sharing that. And in that respect, Todd's death changed the lives of many others, in this case, Melanie. How do those changes play out even today, years after his passing?
Yeah. It's so interesting, because I think Todd was the first of our friends in that fraternity who passed away. We've had some since. And that was the first funeral that generation in his fraternity had ever done. They have a white rose ceremony at the funeral for people who are in, the fraternity. And I think it was the first time that any of them had ever participated in that. And I think if you interviewed, 20 of the Sigma Chi's who were there that day, they would say that Todd's funeral changed my life. And then they would also say that, it altered their path, because when you're in college, you are not thinking about death. Let's be honest. Like, that is not your thought, never. And so I think it really, as it did for Melanie, it clarified what was important. And I'm still seeing that. I'm still friends with most of them on Facebook, even today. And I think they would all say they miss Todd because he was such a big person. He wasn't a big person, but he was just such a big personality. And I think more than anything else, though, for people listening who've lost a child, I've been married, obviously, again, but that seat at their table, no matter which husband, if, who sits in that seat when I'm with them, it's Todd's seat. And so I think for me, it has given me a compassion for parents who lose children, more than even for myself, because I know that although I marry again, they will never, and I'll never have Todd again, but they will really, that is a hole left in a family where the dynamic of siblings change, the dynamic of their future trips, like everything changes when you lose a child. And so that hole, although God feels it, yes, there is a presence that is lost for all of us, but it's so different to lose a child. And so I always say the worst, death to me, a divorce to me is worse than death. And losing a child, there is, like, if you're wanting to compare, we don't need to do that. But at the end of the day, I think the loss of losing a child is just exponential.
So the loss of a spouse at any age can be a crushing emotional weight, but to have that happen in your early 20s seems especially cruel to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners, but certainly those who have experienced a heavy loss, would like to know, how did you begin to heal, and how long did it take for you to begin to feel like things were getting back to, I don't want to use the word normal, but
Yeah.
whatever normal was, or do things ever really get back to normal?
Yeah. I mean, I will say I did a terrible job So I'm just going to say I'm not the poster child for how to heal after loss. I mean, I look back, I went to work 2 weeks after Todd passed away. I never went to a counselor. Let me see all the things that I never did. I did not go through the stages of grief. I never went to grief share. When you are so young and the people in, a grief share class or in any kind of grief recovery, they're older. I was like, how in the world am I going to relate to these people? I wish that somebody would have said, Rachel, let down your pride and go get some help, because I just thought I'm strong. I'm okay. I have a very high capacity for joy. And so I looked so fine. There's literally never been a day that I haven't woken up and thought it was going to be a good day. But at the end of the day, I was a very emotionally bankrupt person. And what I mean by that is I did not know how to feel, Chris. And I think this comes, I hate to say a Southern culture, but we breed children and kids and, adults who just say it's fine and it's not fine. And we don't know how to communicate emotions. We're not brought up with, our parents were raised, I'm 44. So my parents were raised by depression babies who had to just survive. I mean, they were just so happy. Talk about washing out the Ziploc bags. I mean, that was like their life. And so, like, to complain that things aren't great when you have a roof over your head and food on your table, it feels just ridiculous. And so, but I think that breeds a generation of kids who are, I will say there's some value to that because we are resilient. And then there's also this really lack of emotional health that I see in so many of, my friends and people that I know. It's like we can't really we don't know how to attach emotion to what we're feeling or to talk about it because we just don't have an emotional vocabulary. So I was like, beyond bankrupt in emotional vocabulary. And so but what I did do is I worshiped, and I would sit on my floor and I would listen to Fernando Ortega's. I actually heard it this morning, which is so funny. I would sit on my floor and listen to Fernando Ortega's Give Me Jesus. And I had no idea what I was doing, but worship and music will take you out of your thinking brain into an elevated creative brain. And I had no idea that I was actually taking the focus off my own self and the weightiness of grief onto the Lord and his goodness. And so I look back and I'm like, well, golly, that was the smartest thing I did. Because I did whole lot of other dumb things. And I will say for those of you who are going through grief, look at the things where you are hiding, because I would go on Saturdays, I would just wear out a path from TJ Maxx to Hobby Lobby to all my little stores. And I overdrafted like 5 times after Todd died because I had no control over my finances. And I look back and I think, wow, that was so broken too. Like, I mean, I would say, get somebody to get in the weeds with you on your budget and how you spend money. And oh my gosh, I wish, I'm so thankful that the Lord introduced me to Dave Ramsey through my brother and sister-in-law at that time. They were like doing the baby steps. They were like, go to Huntsville with me to this thing. And I was like, okay, I guess. And of course, I went and it changed my life. I love Dave. I'm so grateful for him. I would drive around in my car as a drug rep and listen to Dave Ramsey. I'd call in on the show like a crazy person. I still can't believe I called in on the show. I'm like, who's calling in on Dave Ramsey at 25 years old? But I was just so hungry. My parents were very fiscally responsible, but they didn't teach me about debt, and they didn't teach me, they taught me how not to have it, but I didn't know finances. So all that to say, I did a lot of things to heal that I didn't even know were good. And one of those was worship. So.
When did you meet your second husband, Blair Faulkner?
Oh, yes, Blair Faulkner. Blair was supposed to be an usher at our wedding, at mine and Todd's wedding, which is just amazing. He was, off in the wild blue yonder flying somewhere, so he couldn't come home for our wedding, which was, we were so sad, but I didn't know him. He was just a family friend. So we actually have pictures of Todd and Blair burying each other in the sand on Jekyll Island as children, as like, 7 and 11, it's just 7 and 12 or however what the difference was between them. I mean, I look back at those pictures and I'm like, who would have thought the common denominator in this photo would have been me? It's just like, what? But I saw Blair the Thanksgiving after Todd passed away a year later. I saw him driving, and he was with another family friend that I knew, and I had given Blair's mom a birthday party in mine and Todd's apartment. I mean, like, I knew his parents better than I knew him, and so I was like, gosh, Blair Faulkner loves Jesus. He's a fighter pilot, which is so sexy. I mean, let's be honest. Like, I always say, you can be the ugliest person ever and look good in a flight suit. Like, we just have this amnesia what people look like when you have on a flight suit. But Blair was cute and he looked great in a flight suit. And it was, I was just like, wow. I mean, he needs a wife. He loves Jesus. I should sign up for that. And of course, my mom, small town, my mom and Blair's mom talked together. They kind of had a little chat about it. I don't know how, somehow we got connected. And he asked, we ended up having our first date the day before Christmas Eve. And he brought me a Beth Moore devotional. And I hadn't kissed a whole lot of frogs at this point, but I had had several dates and they had not brought me Beth Moore devotionals. One of them brought me a teddy bear that played the Alabama fight song. And I just thought, oh my, this is definitely, I just need to stop this date right now. Like, if you're bringing me a teddy bear at 25, we have problems. Oh my gosh. But anyway, so Blair brought me this devotional, and I remember just thinking, this is it. I remember truly knowing I was going to marry him that night, which sounds so crazy. But when you've been widowed, you have this knowing of exactly what you want in a husband. And so anyway, 2 weeks later, I told him I couldn't even help myself. I told him I loved him. We've gone to New Orleans. He lived in New Orleans. So he flew the A-10 in New Orleans, which is the Warthog for those of you listening. It's an amazing plane. It's so sexy. And, he shot the Gallon gun and dropped bombs. And, here I was selling drugs. I was like, we are just like quite the combo, quite the combo. And we kept up the long distance thing. We got engaged in April and married in July. It was, the second amazing wedding. And life was just, it was stunning. I mean, we had a list of 100 restaurants in New Orleans. And that, again, dual income, no kids with a dog. That was our life, was eating our way through New Orleans. So it was just a great life.
You joked as your second marriage began that you felt protected, that God would not take your second husband, even as a flight mission specialist in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. He made it home safely from there this time, but sadly, you learned on April 23rd, 2008, that you weren't protected, were you? Mm-hmm. Can you describe the day that Blair was killed?
Yeah. So I was, I will say it's so interesting. I think about protection so differently now, because at the end of the day, I know God never left me. On that day, April 23rd, Blair was doing what he did. He was an instructor pilot at the time. He had a 21-year-old student whose wife was 7 months pregnant, and they went out on a mission that morning. He was flying 3 times that day, and the mission at 12:30, they took off, and the cable in the wing of his T-38 could have never known. It would have taken, I think they have a 15-year analytics of the plane, and it would have been the 15-year analytics that would have picked this up. And he and Matthew took off. The cable snapped. They had no lift from the left whatever you call it, flap, and they couldn't take off, and they immediately flipped, and Matthew and Blair are killed instantly from blunt force trauma to the head. They both ejected, but obviously the ejection seat between 0 and 50 does not work the way it's supposed to. You just don't have the trajectory, you don't have the lift. And so they were both killed, and I was left with a 5-month-old and a 2-year-old on that beautiful, I can still remember the day. It was that crisp April morning. And I just, it's so interesting looking back and thinking how we would joke, oh, God would never allow that to happen. And the reality is that, Chris, I really believe that because we live in this fallen world, that there are so many things that happen that, yes, granted, God could stop things if he wanted to, but the enemy reigns on the earth. And that's what's so hard, I think, for us as believers and me as a believer to understand, is that he has dominion over this earth. And so these terrible things, cancer and disease, and this is just the results of sin on the earth, not our sin, but just the general world. And so I look back and I'm like, people always want somebody to blame. I'm like, blame the enemy, because that's what happened that day. The enemy won, but yet he didn't. He didn't win. I mean, that's what's so crazy, because I will say more people through Blair's death have come to know Jesus. Genesis 50:20, it says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good and for the saving of many lives. And I quote that verse all the time, because honestly, that is our life. Like, the enemy intended to take me out for the second time, and he was not successful. He was horribly unsuccessful. And like, honestly, I wake up every day and he regrets. He regrets that he messed with me twice, because that, and I think that happens to people. We're so resolved when you walk in the kingdom, and when you walk in light, and when you know that the heart is where the good is. Oh man, I mean, there is just this knowing in me that, yeah, way more damage than if it hadn't happened. So, which is hard to admit, but true.
So Rachel, here's a fun story we like to share with folks. You and your family have had experiences with not one, but two U.S. presidents. We'll get to the second one a little bit later in the show, but the first one involved President George W. Bush when Blair was killed.
Yeah.
Did you take it from there for us, please?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. There's so many moments with death where, you just have to laugh. And this was definitely one of them. Of course, we'd already done this once with Todd, and they have a very different civilian funeral. And, to do it with the military was just a whole different ball game. And the day of, any service member passing away, if the president can, he calls them. And so he called our home phone. I don't know. I mean, obviously he got the number from the base. Well, my mom answered the phone. It was President Bush at the time. And my mom answers the phone, and they say, this is Office of the President. We'd like to speak to Miss Faulkner, and my mom thought it was a joke. And so she says to them, this is no time for joking. My son-in-law has just passed away. Like, obviously, and basically just hung up on him. I don't even know what she said, but I'm still like, how did that happen? Like, I mean, I think you're just so in the moment, and so many things were happening. Of course, I've got, a baby who's crying, and I mean, just life was so chaotic that day. I can't even describe to you. And there were like, hundreds of people outside our house, and all these people waiting on us, and our family was 2 hours away. And anyway, so yeah, I mean, it's pretty classic.
Did you ever try and call back, or was he too afraid?
Well, Jeff Sessions was our representative at the time. And so Jeff tried to get a call through my father-in-law. I was like, I don't need that. I'm so busy. I know he appreciates, Blair's service, and I'm so grateful, but I'm changing some diapers here, So it was, oh gosh, it was just such a season of dumbfoundedness, fog. And, I think for most widows, like, you really don't, I don't know that you're definitely never the same, but I will say the fog lasted for me for about a year. I look back at Kimball's pictures, and I'm just like, she was my baby. And I'm like, I was there, but I wasn't present. And there's such a big difference.
Yeah, I totally understand. So we said at the top of the podcast that you love marriage. I haven't forgotten your third husband, Rod Brown. We were just talking about the power of prayer and praying for others. How did the prayers of others, and maybe a nudge or two, connect you and Rod? And what was he doing, and how did you two meet?
Yeah. So interesting. I was just talking about this weekend, because we travel with this other couple, Tom and Stacy, and they had met Rod almost 16 years ago. And, it's hard for a couple to be friends with a single a lot of times, because you're like, you love them so much, but it's not like you're going to invite a single on your, A lot of times you're not going to be like, let's go on our family vacation with us, right? And so they had prayed, probably a lot for Rod to have a wife so that they could do things together and experience life and travel. And so I look at all his friends. Rod was single, 45, never been married, which was, a little concerning to me. I'm not going to lie when someone introduced us. And of course, it's funny. I mean, I cannot imagine. I actually signed up for eHarmony and took the test when I was widowed. And I just thought, how can I ever fill out this profile and someone not be terrified of me? I mean, I would be terrified of me. I would never click on somebody's profile that said, oh, they've lost two husbands. Like, no. And so I had to really depend on my friends. So I went on very few dates, one or two a year. I mean, honestly, maybe. And I was single for 6 years, but I took a chance. Rod was so gracious in his email. He was protecting me, but I didn't realize it. It felt just so like ridiculous. Honestly, I was like, well, that's why you're not married. He was like, I don't like to communicate via text or phone calls. I, really want to meet you in person. And I was like, okay, well, clearly this is why you're not married, because I live 4 hours from you. That is not going to be easy. And he wouldn't text me. He did not want to emotionally connect to someone he had not been around. Now looking back, I'm like, that was brilliant. At the time, I was like, that's stupid, Of course, I was on the other end of it. So we met in person, and he says, and Chris, you'll believe this, but he says, I didn't take a breath for the first 15 minutes because I had a lot to say, I mean,
I don't get it. What do you mean?
my life had been crazy. So I was like, okay, this is the deal. I know my life is wild. And of course, his friends, honestly, Rod had been in ministry for almost 20, 19, 18 years. And his friends were seriously concerned. Like, are you sure? He dated widows before, but they were really like, whoa, dude, you might want to rethink that if you want to live. And so it was interesting. I didn't have to like convince him or talk him into it, but he was actually dating another Rachel at the time. So I was like, I mean, of course, I didn't know all this till years later, but I'm like, wow, you must have been so confused. Of course, I'm pretty much, driving a minivan. I'm pretty sure the other Rachel was not driving a minivan. And I'll never forget our first date. We go to the park, Piedmont Park, and he's like, I will walk you to your car. And I was like, no, no, I'm good. I got it. Cause I was driving that minivan. I was like, oh, please, Lord, this is like the death of me. I mean, you will never, ever want to call me back if you see that I'm driving a minivan. And he walked me to my car. I got in a ticket, of course, because I'm sure I was running late and parked in some not good spot. It's downtown Atlanta. It's so hard to park. And so anyway, it was just like wildly embarrassing, but I dreamed about him that night, Chris. And I mean, I'm not a dreamer. God typically does not speak to me that way, but the one thing that widows really miss is just, it's not, intimacy in it's just having a person, like having somebody that always knows where you are. And that is what I miss so bad, which sounds so bizarre, but it's rare that anyone, unless there's Life's 360 app, it's rare that anyone knows where you are at all times. And especially as a widow, that felt scary to me. And so the one thing I missed was just that pillow talk, just like, how's your day? And let's catch up a little bit. And I was just in the crux. And so in this dream, I was leaned back in the crux of Rod's arm, and we were, just having pillow talk. And I will never forget sitting straight up in the bed because it was so real. I was like sweating because I thought I had slept with him the first night I met him. So I was like, I ruined my witness. I ruined my witness. Which is just so classic. And I was just terrified that I had like lost myself, and of course that didn't happen. It was a dream, but it was so real. And I knew in that moment, the Lord was showing me, you're going to feel that again. And I did. And not even 2 months later, the power went out at some friends that we were at we were actually going to their house. The power went out, and he was like, hey, let's just sit down so we don't like hurt ourselves in this pitch black house. And we sat down, and he pulled me back in the crux of his arm. And I was like, oh, that's my dream. Oh my gosh, this is the dream. Like it was so, I knew, of course I knew that night. I didn't tell Rod, which was the smartest thing I've ever done. But I knew that night that I was probably going to marry him. And again, widows doesn't take us long to figure it out. And yeah, we dated for not very long. We got engaged in April and then we married in June. Our preacher that married us had two dates. One was July 19th, which was mine and Blair's anniversary, and the other was June 28th. I was like, we cannot get married on July 19th. I cannot have two anniversaries that day. And so June 28th of 2013, we were married. It was an amazing day.
So when we were talking a month or so ago about you joining me for today's show, you accepted in part because you said you have no idea of the thousands of people on the other side of the yes. I love that expression. Can you give us an example of what's happened to you on that other side of yes? And what should our audience take from that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This is like one day I'm going to write a book about this, because we just have no idea how such tiny decisions that we make that feel very insignificant to us, how significant they are to the body of Christ, really. And so I look back. So Rod and I were married in 2013. Rod went through anxiety and depression right after we got married. Can't imagine why. I mean, getting a wife and kids on the same day and moving to the suburbs, like that would probably make anybody depressed and anxious when you've been single your whole life. But it was really, really difficult. We can laugh now, but I'm telling you, I thought I'd ruined my life. I thought I'd ruined my children's life, because as a widow, because your husband died a hero, mine did for sure. You want this new person to be your kid's new hero, And so weakness, or for me, I grew up in a very just strong, gritty family, and so and I'd never struggled with depression. So when you haven't struggled with it personally, you're like, oh, come on, you just got everything you wanted, like, aren't you gonna be, you're fine, like, this is just a moment. And the moment turned into really a nervous breakdown while we were on a mission trip, of all things, a family mission trip. And you can imagine, like, the feelings that I was feeling were just, I was really angry at the Lord. I did not process through my anger in the grief stage. And so it will come out. Like, you may stuff it, and you may stuff it for a lot of years. I did. But that anger is going to come out, and it came out on Rod because he was alive. I think that was my thing. I was like, who am I going to be mad at? I mean, and anger is not being mad at someone. Anger is processing a feeling. And then there's, it's a secondary emotion. So grief is usually behind it. And I just skipped that phase. I skipped a lot of phases. But here I am, I'm looking over at our bed, because I remember so laying in bed and just thinking, I've ruined my life, And so at the end of the day, we were, in this dark place, and this woman said to me, she was like, let's go up to this little cottage here in Milton and let's pray with this woman. I was like, oh my God, like, sometimes the last thing you want to do in the hole is like pray, because I really didn't want to pray. I didn't want to talk to Jesus people. I was just like, ugh. I just hated my life and my existence at this point, which is so okay. The Lord can take it. So we go up to this little cottage. There's this woman there, and she's, there's 12 people in the room, 2 of who I knew and knew my story. And this woman didn't know me at all. And she sits down and she was like, okay, Rachel. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be weird. Like, I've never done anything like this. I've taken prayer requests at Sunday school, but I ain't never done this, And she's like, she was like, your life has been really hard. And I'm like, what? Like, how do you know this? Like, one. And she said, I see you like a crocus coming up out of the ground, and out of the hard winter, and you will declare the goodness of God before the nations. And to say, Chris, that everything in me wanted to fight what she was saying, but everything in me knew what she was saying was true, because I knew that what had happened to me, and even what was currently happening to me, although I was fighting it and hating it, I knew that God, like, I always knew there was something way bigger than me going on. And so it was after that I thought we had started Be Still in Huntsville. We had, drug all of these chairs together, all the little coffee table what card table chairs, that we had, brought them together and let women share their stories. And the first time we did it, we had 120 women show up at this, rancher house in Huntsville. And I just thought, wow, like people really want to hear stories. Like this is amazing. And we had no idea what we were doing. We played a worship song on a jam box. Two women shared their stories and then we prayed for people. And it's never changed. We've done it the same way for 10 years, which is just crazy. But in that moment when Linda prayed for me, it was, as much as I was fighting it and resisting it, I knew it was true. And it was right after that, about 6 months later, that I went and bought 50 chairs from IKEA, slung them in the back of that same minivan, and asked some friends, hey, will you host? Because I didn't have that many friends. I just moved here. And I was like, will you host this at your house? Like you have a community and I really don't here yet. And we had probably 30 women that first day, and it's just grown and grown and grown ever since then. It's still the same. And the crux of the ministry is women and their stories, and really helping women to see that they're lavishly loved daughters of a king who can release the kingdom of heaven on earth, because we think we have to wait to experience heaven till death. And we don't. Like the Lord's like, no, I want you on earth as it is in heaven. That means I want you to experience heaven the moment that you meet the Lord. And I'm just determined that that's possible. And I had no idea, making that purchase at IKEA, how many thousands of women would sit in those white chairs and that tiny little prayer meeting in Milton. And you hear this all the time, but like I could have never foreseen today, which is 7 years later.
So you're committed to helping men and women, especially women, as you're talking about, achieve their great purpose, especially in difficult times.
Mm.
Do we all share the same greater purposes? And what are the differences and similarities, if any, between your greater purpose, my greater purpose, and that of our listeners?
Yeah. I mean, for me, if you know what breaks your heart, Andy Stanley's my pastor, and he always says, what breaks your heart? There is your purpose. And what breaks my heart, two things. The younger version of myself, the widow, 31 years old with two babies, who has no community. That breaks my heart. And then the other thing that breaks my heart is a woman who lives with a secret, and a man who lives with a secret, because I was the child who at 10 years old was abused by a distant family relative, which felt like child's play, but it was not. It actually locked me up in shame for 25 years. And so I look back at my 35-year-old self, who had buried two husbands who really did not know her. They did not know me. That's what's so sad. I look back at Blair and I look back at Todd, and I'm like, they got a part of me, but they did not get who. And granted, we all shift every 5 years. I feel like as a generation, we all change and shift, but like I could not experience. And I actually wrote something down, or read something today that I thought was just, oh my gosh. It says, the trick is you have to want to experience great, deep, soul shattering love more than you want to protect yourself from hurt. Because truthfully, we can never guarantee we won't get hurt. But what we can guarantee is that in the process of protecting ourselves, we will also be preventing ourselves from ever feeling fully loved. Mark Groves. And I mean, to say that women and men do not experience receiving love is the understatement of the century. Receiving, period. I mean, women, we can't even take a compliment. If you tell us we look beautiful, we're like, no, my thighs are fat, they're rubbing together. Look at my hair, I've got so many I mean, I'm like, just stop. Just say thank you. I mean, I have literally to practice taking a compliment. And so I look back and I'm like, okay, so there's your purpose. Like, what is the crappiest thing that's happened to you? I mean, I hate to say that, but honestly, look back over your life. Like, what is that thing that you're like, oh, I wish I could change that? It's like the very thing that you wish you could change is really the thing that leads you to your purpose. It really is. Like, the worst thing that happens to you ends up being the greatest gift that ever was. Like, the good is in the hard. It just is. I can't explain it. It's just the gospel. That's just the way I will work everything for good. He's made that promise to us, and it's so true. I don't know why we just fight it though. It's like, just go look back through your life and find that thing where you're like, one, that breaks my heart, and two, that was the hardest thing that ever happened to me. Because that to me is where you'll find your purpose.
You've described yourself as a champion of freedom. A lot of people believe that religion and faith are confining, that it creates too many rules to follow. How does your faith give you freedom?
Well, that's true if you live in the old covenant. But for a new covenant believer, God said, I am giving you a new heart. I mean, he prophesied this in Ezekiel 36. I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to take away your heart of stone. Because when you do live in the old covenant, you live as, I'm never going to be good enough. And God is always going to be mad at me. And it could not be further from the truth when you recognize the real reality and how good the gospel really is. So I will say religion is confining. Religion is not the goal. I always thought, and you hear people say, oh, I'm so religious. It's like, that ain't the goal. The goal of Christianity is receiving love. And honestly, Chris, if that's like the rest of the gospel. I don't think very few people that are talking about that as being the gospel. But if you know how to receive love from God and you know how to attach, man, it changes everything. And I think when you realize that the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament, it's all for provision, and you get to take the promises and you get to take the protection that that the 10 Commandments provides. You get to take all that good stuff, but you get to walk in freedom. And then you know what the goal is? You know what the whole command is? Receive and believe that Jesus loved you first so that you can love others. I mean, I'm like, oh, this is it, because that changes everything. Because honestly, and when you realize too that everything that Jesus said, although it's amazing, it does not apply. Everything Jesus said in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John does not apply to you. We think it does, but everything he was saying was elevating the law to this place of impossibility for the Pharisees to live up to. And so I know that's pretty theological, but at the end of the day, when you realize that everything he says after the cross, everything changed after the cross. So you have to look at everything that Jesus says. Was this before or after the cross? That literally changed my life. Oh my gosh, so changed my life.
So we have about 2 minutes left. And we mentioned earlier in the show that you and your family have had experiences with 2 US presidents. Can you tell us the funny story about meeting President Trump and praying over him?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So I was in DC last January. It was amazing. Got to go to the White House, Trump Hotel, the whole thing. It was insane. I couldn't believe it. I'd never met a president face to face. I thought Ivanka was coming to our dinner. President Trump shows up, it's this women's meeting, 150, 75 women. And so I video this prayer. I'm standing really close and I video the prayer and put it on my Instagram, of course. Well, the next morning I get home and Fox News has the prayer and says something about Be Still Ministries. It wasn't even related to Be Still. I could not believe it. I'm like, what? Oh my gosh, this is my prayer. How did they get this? It has nothing to do with Be Still. It's just my personal Instagram. And I felt terrible. And the girl who sponsored the dinner was like so upset. And I was like, oh gosh, this is so bad. But I tell you what, it just reminded me, like, fact checking, very important, because that could not have been further from the truth. But I was so privileged to be in the room. I don't care if you agree with them or not. It's an honor to be near a president and to be in the mix of that, just to be in the White House. I'm a patriot at heart. So for me, it was like, this is amazing. Yeah,
Love that
it was funny.
Love that. Rachel Faulkner Brown, thanks so much for being with us today. And thank you to our audience for tuning in to Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details about upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.